The bell above the door clanged with a resonating echo as I stepped into the quaint bookshop. My initial aim was simply to peruse the shelves in peace. However, the loud announcement of my entrance disrupted this simple plan. A quick glance around the room revealed an almost vacant interior, an intimate little shop devoid of a shopkeeper. This sight held out the promise of the tranquil exploration I had initially hoped for. Tucked away in an obscure corner of the town, the bookshop was a challenge to find, and even more so to comprehend. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, yet they were bare, devoid of any books. The only tomes present were about 15 volumes displayed on a large stone table at the center of the room, and a handful more on the counter. As I ventured across the dimly lit shop floor, the antiquity of the place was palpable. The worn wood and aged fixtures whispered tales of time gone by. This was exactly the kind of shop I cherished, a place that held the potential for unearthing unusual and rare books. The books laid out on the table were bound in leather, a sight that instantly piqued my curiosity. As my fingers traced over the surface of the books, appreciating the craftsmanship of the bindings, a voice startled me from behind. A sudden turn nearly sent the books tumbling onto the floor. The voice belonged to a small, elderly man, undoubtedly the bookshop owner. Dressed in a grey suit as old as himself, he introduced himself as Mordecai Blackthorne. My faux pas was quickly forgiven, and our conversation turned to the books. I couldn't help but comment on the scarcity of his collection, given the ample space of his shop. His response was one of a man who'd grown selective with age, choosing to retain only the volumes that held a special place in his heart. His personal collection, as he put it. Despite their personal value, the books were still on sale, albeit at a hefty price. But for such rarities, the cost was expected. The shop's obscure location, and the effort it took to find it, seemed to mirror the elusive nature of the books it housed. As I delved deeper into the volumes laid out on the table, I noticed a common thread running through them. Each book dealt with subjects of a darker nature. There were many volumes about murders, torture from the Middle Ages, and several volumes about infamous crimes and their perpetrators. While I never held much esteem for this genre, I must admit that rather, I was very curious about the contents these books held. I am shocked and surprised at the subject matter of these books, and maybe even more shocked that these are the few books you chose to hold on to out of your collection, I said to the Mr. Blackthorne. Mr. Wycliffe, I know what you may be thinking about this type of literature. It's always been fascinating to me, the capability of man's innate potential to bring harm to others. Inhumanity to man, as they would say. Please, Mr. Wycliffe, don't misunderstand my fondness for these books. It is merely a hobby and not a lifestyle. I only read about these subjects and do not actively participate. Come with me, he said. I want to show you some of my most precious possessions. After what seemed like 30 minutes or more, I grew weary of Blackthorne's endless sales pitch about his books, which, although fascinating, held little value. While I was intrigued by the subject matter, the exorbitant prices he asked for made me hesitant to purchase them. Oh no, Mr. Wycliffe. I urge you remain a while longer, as I have one more book I must show you. I believe you will find its subject matter and price too good to pass up. Please, Mr. Wycliffe, kindly allow this old man a few more minutes of your time. Okay, the last volume. This book is the jewel of my collection, said Blackthorne. To ensure its value is not undermined by others who may not appreciate it, I keep it on the back shelf. However, I trust you, Mr. Wycliffe. Please have a little look. The book was bound in luxurious brown leather, with a leather strap and bronze buckle to keep it tightly closed. Although the book was quite old and visibly well used, it was still in decent condition. What puzzled me was that there was no title on the cover or spine. My confusion must have been apparent as Blackthorne picked up on my thoughts right away. The title is on the opening page. You'll have to undo the buckle to discover what it is, Mr. Blackthorne declared. Although it seemed like a tedious task, I had come this far, so I obliged and opened the book by undoing the buckle and strap. Mr. Blackthorne was almost giddy with excitement at the sight of it. The book title read Vengeful Acts. As I perused the book, I was particularly struck by the title, and I soon found myself equally intrigued by the rest of the content. It was unbelievable to think that a book of this magnitude, almost 1,000 pages, was entirely handwritten. As a collector of rare books, I suspected that this was a diary or journal of some sort. My fascination with this book only grew with each passing moment. "This book is very unusual," I said, turning to Mr. Blackthorne. "How did you come across it?" Blackthorne then said, "I acquired it as a young lad and have held on to it for a considerable length of time. While the subject matter doesn't particularly captivate me, I must admit that the book would be a great addition to my personal collection. It would undoubtedly make for an intriguing conversation starter." Blackthorne agreed. "I assure you, Mr. Wycliffe, adding this book to your collection would be a great decision. Are you interested in buying it?" Taking up the book and examining it again, I replied, "Yes, Mr. Blackthorne, I believe I might, if your asking price isn't too steep." "I must say, Mr. Blackthorne, the price you're offering seems quite reasonable, almost too much so," I told him. Deep down I knew that I would gladly pay a higher price for this book if necessary. I had grown attached to it over time. "Don't be silly, Mr. Wycliffe. If anything, you would be doing me a great favor. I've owned this shop for quite some time and plan to retire soon. It would bring me great comfort to know that someone who appreciates the book's value will take good care of it," he responded. "I can't really refuse then, can I?" "I've a single bag left to put it in," he said as he stuffed the money I'd passed him into the pocket of his suit trousers. "Actually, sir, I have a satchel here. It will stay safe until I'm home. Thank you for your time and generosity." Blackthorne's expression was a mixture of relief and sorrow as he spoke. "I'm the one who is grateful, sir. Your words have brought me more peace of mind than you can imagine. Have a good day." "Good day to you, sir," I said courteously before turning around to open the door. The little bell over the entrance rang out again, but this time it didn't feel as bothersome as before. Blackthorne couldn't help but feel a sense of finality as the shop door closed and Cedric Wycliffe moved away. He knew his role in this nightmare was about to come to an end. After decades of frustration, he had finally completed the task. While he felt terrible for Mr. Wycliffe, the relief he was experiencing outweighed his emotions. Checking the lock on the door, Blackthorne slowly made his way to the rear of the shop, his home for many years. The back room, once a storage facility, had since been converted into his living quarters. Upon entering, he approached an old dresser adorned with many photographs, each one more faded than the last. As he looked at the pictures of his wife and family, a tear formed in his eye. They had all passed away long ago, and Blackthorne had outlived them all. Given that he was almost 200 years old, this was not a surprise. As he gently touched each photograph, he spoke to them in a soft, loving tone. "Forgive me, please. I didn't have a choice." Blackthorne walked away and shed his torn and tattered clothes. He sat on a worn-out chair and tears streamed down his face as he anxiously awaited what was to come. "Finally, it's over. Lord, forgive me." Blackthorne started moaning in pain. He could almost deal with it to begin with, but as seconds started to pass, he started to scream. His body started to shrivel, as if he was being dried inside out. His eyes shrunk back into his head, and his skin began to mummify. His limbs twisted into impossible angles. His backbone started to push through his chest and stomach. Still screaming, Blackthorne's bones and body began to fall apart. His jaws fell open in a disturbing, gaping maw. His screams almost faded now. He managed to say once more, "Finally!" A few minutes later, Blackthorne was gone. His body was gone, all but a mound of bones and dust in the seat of the old chair. I had completely forgotten about the book for a brief period of time after bringing it back to my townhouse and placing it next to my reading chair in the library. Unfortunately, my life quickly became disordered, and I scarcely had the chance to read it at all. As I navigated a difficult period, my wife, Eleonora, revealed she wanted to end our marriage. Although I was aware of our marital issues, I was caught off guard by her decision. From the start, our relationship had been under strain due to various factors. My demanding job at the accounting firm, my love for literature, which Eleonora saw as trivial, her frequent absence as she worked for charitable organizations, and most importantly, our childless marriage. Despite our ability to conceive, Eleonora refused to have children, which left me feeling resentful. This unresolved issue was a constant source of tension between us. Despite my attempts to speak with Eleonora about saving our marriage, she was unresponsive and retreated to her room. She only emerged to leave the house. One evening, after returning from work, I discovered that she and all of her belongings were gone. For the rest of that night, I sat alone in the dark, pondering what to do next. Eventually, I resolved that my best course of action would be to harbor resentment towards her. As the carriage came to a stop in front of a 2-story brick building located just off the main square of the city, I noticed the sign over the door read, A. Whitewood, Accountant. That must be my employer, Alaric. He was a likable enough fellow, but a bit too full of himself due to owning the most reputable accounting firm in the city. However, what many didn't know was that Alaric Whitewood had little knowledge of accounting. He inherited the firm from his father, and without the expertise of his employees, the business would have closed its doors long ago. As with every other workday, I entered the building and headed straight for my desk, located in the far back corner of the room. My desk was intentionally positioned away from windows and doors, as I found it easier to focus on tasks at hand. It was a quiet, uninterrupted spot, and I'd grown accustomed to its familiarity. However, on this day, things took an unexpected turn. As the late afternoon sun began to set, I was feeling accomplished in my efforts to lighten my workload. I prefer to leave my desk clear at the end of the day. Suddenly I was jolted from my focus by the presence of someone standing at the front of my desk. Lifting my head, I was taken aback to see Alaric Whitewood staring down at me, his arms overflowing with papers and ledger books. "My apologies, Mr. Whitewood. I didn't even realize you were there," I admitted as I stood up, feeling a bit embarrassed. It turns out, Alaric has chosen me to complete a major project. Unfortunately, Mr. Ravenshaw will be presenting to a prospective buyer on Monday morning, and the accounts are in shambles. Alaric seemed to be relishing my discomfort, as he informed me that it would probably take me the whole weekend and tonight to get everything in order. "I understand that you have plans for the weekend, Wycliffe," Mr. Whitewood said, "but I have already committed to Mr. Ravenshaw, and I intend to keep that commitment." My heart sank at his words. "I hope you value your position here as much as I do, Wycliffe," he continued. "You don't have a wife or family to attend to, so I trust that your job is a top priority for you." Despite my objections, Mr. Whitewood's decision had been made. In an instant, a mix of shame and anger washed over me. How could he use my personal life against me in this power struggle? I couldn't contain my outrage and shouted, "Mr. Whitewood, your behavior has left me appalled." Yes, I'm sure it has," Whitewood said as he started turning away. "The question is, Wycliffe, how appalled are you? Enough to end your employment here or not?" Whitewood's behavior was beyond appalling, and despite my strong urge to retaliate, I resisted. However, given my current circumstances, which Whitewood was fully aware of, I had no choice but to comply. As I sat back in my chair, I reluctantly agreed to finish the project, letting out a defeated, "Very well, Mr. Whitewood." Handing over the key to the front door, he spoke with his usual arrogance. "I knew you would, Wycliffe. I knew you would. As you can see, while you were making a much bigger issue out of this than it should have been, everyone else has gone home. Let yourself in and out as much as you need to finish the work this weekend. Make sure to lock the door behind me when I leave," he stated, grabbing his coat. "I have a new lady friend waiting for me in the carriage outside." I accompanied Alaric to lock up the front door, all the while struggling to contain my seething hatred for him. As he stepped out, a carriage pulled up, waiting for him. I caught a glimpse of a woman inside, waiting for him. Our eyes met briefly, and she acknowledged me with a smug smile, clearly asserting her dominance. Alaric leaned over to kiss her as he sat down. It was then that I realized, with a heavy heart, that the woman in the carriage was my own wife, Eleonora. My emotions got the best of me in that moment, and I lost control. I threw papers and ledgers from the desks, and even sent lamps and inkwells flying against the walls. I wanted to unleash even more destruction, but I eventually collapsed on the floor and broke down in tears. I can't remember how long I remained there, but I eventually left the office and began a long walk home. I left the front door open, hoping that someone would enter the accounting firm and cause more chaos. It felt like a fitting punishment for what had happened. Returning home late at night, I collapsed into my reading chair in the library, too tired to move. My plan was to drink myself to sleep, but something caught my eye. A book I purchased at the shop had been submerged under the pile of unread books. Maybe it was the title that drew me in, but I felt compelled to pick it up. Vengeful Acts. How fitting for my long journey home. I had been deliberating on how to get revenge and retribution from my courtesan wife. and that despicable ex-boss I just walked out on, Alaric Whitewood. As I plucked the book from the stack, a shiver coursed through me. The tome seemed to hum with secrets, promising a glimpse into unfathomable mysteries. Yet a strange unease held me captive, as if the mere act of unsealing this treasure would seal my fate. And so I lingered, clutching the book, hesitant to enter its enchanting embrace. But the siren call of the unknown grew louder, until my heart swayed with a curiosity that outshone my fear. And with trembling fingers, I unfurled the pages, venturing into an uncharted realm. At first glance, the tome appeared to be a mundane relic, its pages weathered by time's gentle caress. Yet with a curious gaze, I noticed its peculiarities, a lack of birth date or ownership, and no name to honor the author's craft. Such oddities bewitched me, for a book bereft of such details is a rare enigma. The title alone stood sentinel, shrouding the book's secrets in a cloak of mystery. Acts of Vengeance was noticeably in calligraphy, with strong and exaggerated strokes. One particular page in the book caught my attention as it contained a language that was unfamiliar to me. The intricate symbols and angled lines seemed like a puzzle that I would have to solve later, as I was eager to explore the other sections of the book. Upon turning the pages, I noticed that the book was divided into many distinct sections, each with its own unique handwriting. Some sections were written in cursive, while others were printed. I found myself struggling to read some, while others were easy to understand. Curiosity piqued, I flipped back to the beginning of the book and started reading from the first section. Upon reading, I was astonished to discover that it was a complete narrative of a man's quest for revenge against a neighboring landowner accused of stealing food from his storage barns. It was evident from the language he used that it occurred a long time ago. The story was fully detailed, including every aspect up to the gory retelling of how he'd exacted his revenge by finding the man out working his own fields. He ran him through countless times with a rusted pitchfork. The pure joy the author took in this vengeful act was more than apparent by his writing, while I myself was sickened by his awful tale. He even signed it, Victor Shadowborn. Captivated by the narrative, I was taken aback, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I had to read all the remaining chapters. Each one was an awful tale of vengeance signed by the person who exacted their revenge. As I continued to read, I began to have thoughts of vengeance against those who screwed me over. Sick fantasies filled my mind as I considered seeking justice against them. However, I knew that violence just wasn't in me. Reading some of the chapters, or at least the ones that I could make out, I began to feel physically ill, as people described the great lengths they went to so they could get their revenge. Without realizing it, I had read all night. The sunlight was just inching its way across the floor as I came to the last entry in the book. Exhausted, I considered saving it for another time, but my mind was far from being capable of sleep, so I decided to read it after all. The author recounts a tale of sibling betrayal that resulted in him being cheated out of his rightful inheritance. His passion for literature had led him away from the family business, a fact that infuriated his brothers and led them to view him as lazy and undeserving of his share of the family fortune. Through the use of deception and unscrupulous lawyers, they were able to successfully deny him his rightful inheritance. Something in him snapped. Betrayal, pain, and vengeance drove him beyond what he thought he was capable of. His entry went on to describe how, late one evening, shortly after the betrayal, under the pretense of reconciling with his brothers, he arranged to visit in their mansion they'd inherited. While appearing to be sincere, his motives were far more sinister. Roughly halfway through dinner, the drug he'd managed to put into their food began to take effect. The drug wasn't meant to kill, but to incapacitate. His brothers couldn't move, but were fully conscious. He taunted them and laughed. He tortured them until they were bloody and bruised. Then, in a final ultimate act of revenge, he set fire to the room. He stayed, watching the flames burn the flesh of his brothers, their eyes wide with terror. He laughed manically as he left the house, more than disappointed he couldn't watch them burn. How awful! This entry was by far the most diabolical and disgusting. It occurred to me that each entry was worse the further down I got in terms of how sickening the murderous acts were. I was glad I'd finished with the book. As I began to close it, I noticed that the last entry bore the signature of its author. As I read it, pure terror took over my very being. I'd met this murderer not long ago. The author's name was Mordecai Blackthorne, the owner of the bookstore The moment I saw the name of the author, a strong electric current surged through me. Though I wanted to jump out of my seat, I was paralyzed and unable to move. The pain was so intense. The pain had left me motionless, except for the awful spasms that every muscle in my body was experiencing. I hoped that this, whatever it was, would be short-lived. My mind had remained very clear so far, but that was about to end. As the pain persisted, I became disoriented. It wasn't dizziness, but rather an inability to maintain my thought process. I couldn't concentrate, and it felt like my thoughts were no longer my own. A montage of thoughts and images swirled before my eyes, which I kept tightly shut due to the agony. The thoughts in my mind were horrible. My mind was creating disturbing visions of the stories I'd just read. They rapidly appeared in quick succession in my mind's eye with such vivid detail. It was as if I was watching all of the brutal murders in the book. Contemplating my current situation, I felt a rising anger within me. I was being dealt an unfair hand and didn't deserve any of it. All of my hard work and devotion to my spouse and employer were being tossed aside as if they meant nothing. The situation was threatening to strip me of everything I had worked for, my job, my marriage, and even my self-respect. But I was determined to hold on to my dignity, no matter what. As I wiped the final remnants of shaving cream off my face, I caught a glimpse of the straight razor. I paused to admire the ivory handle and the sharpness of the blade. It was truly a stunning piece. I couldn't help but contemplate the fact that while the razor was primarily invented as a practical tool, it also had the potential to be a lethal weapon. As I gazed at the razor, I couldn't help but imagine how it could be the perfect tool for seeking justice and vengeance. My reflection revealed the tired eyes and disheveled appearance of a broken man, but also an unsettling grin as I realized what needed to be done. The book. I realized that the book was the root cause of this inexplicable horror. If I could only distance myself from it, I could escape this nightmare. Summoning all my strength and willpower, I attempted to let go of the book, which was still clutched in my trembling hands. Struggling to release my grip, I attempted to lift the book from my lap despite the searing pain. As I peered into its pages, I was confronted with a sight that nearly drove me to the brink of insanity. The once black ink had transformed into a ghastly shade of red, resembling blood. It seemed as if the words were bleeding onto the pages, causing rivulets of red to flow down the book and onto my lap in large, horrifying droplets. In a panic, I hurled the book across the room, but it wouldn't budge from my grasp. I tried to shake it off, only to realize the book was clinging to me. The leather cover had melded with my fingers, enveloping them all the way up to my wrist. A sense of helplessness washed over me as I struggled against the book's hold, completely at its mercy. The pain became more intense until I felt myself passing out. Trapped in a dreamy state, visions of torture and murder became extremely vivid. It was like I was watching each death from above. But as I watched, my attitude changed. Over time, I found myself becoming less frightened and started to admire the ingenuity of the individuals. I also couldn't help but take some joy of the sheer viciousness in the acts. Captivated, I witnessed a remarkable transformation unfolding in my thoughts as each scenario played out before me. Noticed that the murderer in every vision was becoming familiar to me. Suddenly, in one last, blood-soaked vision, the murderer turned and looked at me. I screamed in pure terror. My face contorted into a horrifying, maniacal expression. It was then that I realized that the culprit behind all of the heinous deeds was none other than myself. I saw that the victim of my butchery in this last vision had been Alaric Whitewood just before passing out. I couldn't tell how long I'd been asleep, but judging by my disheveled appearance and sore muscles, it must have been a while. I quickly made myself a light breakfast and went to the bathroom to freshen up. As I was halfway through shaving, it dawned on me that there was no real reason to look presentable anymore. With my wife gone and my termination from the accounting firm likely due to my actions, I had nowhere to go. Contemplating my current situation, I felt a rising anger within me. I was being dealt an unfair hand and didn't deserve any of it. All of my hard work and devotion to my spouse and employer were being tossed aside as if they meant nothing. The situation was threatening to strip me of everything I had worked for, my job, my marriage, and even my self-respect. But I was determined to hold on to my dignity no matter what. As I wiped the final remnants of shaving cream off my face, I caught a glimpse of the straight razor. I paused to admire the ivory handle and the sharpness of the blade. It was truly a stunning piece. I couldn't help but contemplate the fact that while the razor was primarily invented as a practical tool, it also had the potential to be a lethal weapon. As I gazed at the razor, I couldn't help but imagine how it could be the perfect tool for seeking justice and vengeance. My reflection revealed the tired eyes and disheveled appearance of a broken man, but also an unsettling grin as I realized what needed to be done. As I crouched in the bushes outside Alaric Whitewood's mansion, I realized that I had grown accustomed to the darkness, both the darkness of the night and the shadowy condition of my own soul. Whitewood's residence, situated far from the city and any major roads, made it an easy target for anyone who wished him harm. I was able to approach his house unnoticed, thanks to the remoteness of the property and the obscurity of the night. After waiting for hours and observing the house, I noticed the lights slowly flicker off, one by one. Only the upstairs bedroom remained illuminated. I was somewhat familiar with the house, as I had often delivered work to Alaric on days when he preferred not to come to the office. Once the last light was extinguished, I approached the back of the house and attempted to open the rear entrance. Although I lacked experience in burglary, I proceeded with great care and caution. Despite taking longer than expected, I eventually succeeded in unlocking the door. I didn't hesitate at the entranceway because of fear or uncertainty. I simply wanted to ensure I was ready for what lay ahead. I took a few deep breaths and shook my arms and legs to loosen them before crossing the threshold with razor in hand. Moving with caution and care, I descended the staircase leading to the upstairs. My heart was racing as I drew closer to my target. The last thing I wanted was to make a mistake and lose my chance for revenge. Suddenly, the faint creak of a wooden step made me freeze in terror. I waited motionless, hoping that my prey had not been awakened by the sound. My next step was calculated and precise, with my foot placed as close to the edge of the stair as possible. Clutching the railing tightly, I continued my ascent up the stairs with painstaking slowness. At the top of the stairs, I had a sudden realization that I didn't know which room belonged to Alaric. My confidence faded, as I didn't want to go through each room while trying to remain unnoticed. After a few moments, I regained my composure and remembered that the last light to go out in the house would indicate the right room. With this insight, I located the door I believed to be the correct one. For several minutes I pressed my ear against the door, trying to listen for any sounds, but my pounding heart made it difficult to hear anything other than my own blood rushing through my veins. I took a deep breath and willed myself to calm down, until I finally heard the sound of snoring coming from the room. My excitement grew. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Without hesitation, I reached for the doorknob, then stopped myself and covered my mouth to stifle my excitement. An intense feeling of amusement came over me, just as I was about to commit the ultimate act of mischief. I couldn't help but relish the moment. At last, I was fully prepared. With great care, I turned the doorknob and silently slipped into the room. The bedroom was shrouded in darkness, with heavy curtains blocking out almost all natural light. I paused at the doorway to let my eyes adjust to the gloomy setting. Gradually, I began discerning the room's layout. The massive four-poster bed loomed directly across from me. With a straight razor in hand, I inched forward, steadily moving towards the bed. Alaric Whitewood was fast asleep, snoring loudly. His snoring was actually a relief, as it would help to muffle any noise I might make as I crossed the room. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally stood beside him. Conveniently, he was sleeping on his back, leaving his throat exposed to the night. This is it. This was my moment of revenge. This is where I got my vengeance on the man who had cost me everything. Still, I hesitated because I wanted to enjoy every second of taking this man's life. I'd envisioned this moment many times. I wanted to make sure I do this right. I wanted him to suffer, to feel pain. Most importantly, I wanted him to know it was me. I leered over him low enough to hold the razor right his throat. I had to time this perfectly. Alaric was an imposing figure, and any misstep on my part could be catastrophic. With one hand on his chest, I positioned the other just inches above his mouth, ready to act quickly and silence him if necessary, just before I drew the razor across his throat. My hands were shaking from adrenaline. I had to strike fast. I threw my hand across his mouth whilst pushing down with all of my strength on his head. His eyes now open, focus on me immediately. I could see a lot in his eyes. The terror of realizing what I was about to do and who I was. Alaric suddenly started kicking and hitting me in the face. I had no time to enjoy the moment any longer. I slashed the razor across his throat. Blood sprayed out like a geyser, covering both of us. Instinctively, I jump away from him for just a second. But then he rose from the bed, hands on his throat, and tried to run, but he couldn't. Now recovered from the shock of what I'd done, I let my anger consume me. "Die, you prick!" I yelled while slashing at him again. The blade caught his face, cutting through both of his cheeks. I began to slash like a madman as he leant helplessly in front of me. "You took my soulmate! Slash! You took my job! Slash! You took my life! Slash!" It suddenly dawned on me that my strikes were hitting nothing. I was swinging the razor aimlessly in the air, gasping for breath. I stopped in my tracks, only to see Alaric lying on the ground between my feet and the bed. He was sliced to ribbons. Fingers were missing. His eyes were gone. Blood was pooling on the floor from his head. I'd done it. I'd killed the man that ruined me. I'd taken my revenge. Standing in the darkness, time seemed to stretch on, though in reality, it was only a matter of moments. The emotions that coursed through me were indescribable, a pure sense of ecstasy that I had never before experienced. There was no fear or remorse, only a feeling of accomplishment that made me feel like a true man. It was a moment of completion, of triumph, until one sound shattered everything. "Alaric," a female voice said, "are you okay?" As I turned around, I was met with the silhouette of a woman standing in the bedroom doorway. It was my wife, Eleonora, donning a flowing nightdress and holding a lit candle. We locked eyes simultaneously and shared a moment of recognition. Her initial response was to turn back down the hall, while I grinned and savored the moment, to revel in the idea that my revenge wasn't finished yet. This was a lot more than I could wish for. Picture Eleonora running towards the stairway. Her nightdress hiked up with one hand, while the other grips a candle lamp to illuminate the way. I stretch out one hand in an attempt to catch her, and the other hand holding the razor. Eleonora screaming at the top of her lungs, while I shouted to her to stop. Such a funny sight. I had to laugh. As I reached the top of the stairs, I caught up to her and seized the back of her neck. She retaliated by attempting to hit me with the candle lamp, but missed and instead covered us both in hot wax. Strangely, neither of us seemed to feel the pain. "Stop, Cedric, don't," she pleaded with me. "You can't kill me, please, you can't." "Oh, but I can," I said. In between sobs and trying to catch her breath, she asked, "Why are you doing this?" Angrily, I responded to her, "How dare you ask me that?" My words were accompanied by spittle splashing onto her face. I reminded her that she had treated me terribly throughout our entire marriage and only saw me as a means to an end. When that wasn't enough, you left me for that dead man in the other room. And you're obviously living in his house. Are you sleeping in his bed as well? "No, Cedric," she cried. "I'm only... poor Alaric." Aggressively, I raised my voice and brought her face close to mine as I tightened my grip on her throat. "Be quiet," I exclaimed, showing no interest in her excuses or begging for forgiveness. "Your words hold no value to me, just as mine held none to you for years. The only thing that concerns me now is that you pay the price for your betrayal," I whispered as I leaned in to kiss her. It was a fierce, intense kiss, a farewell kiss. I pushed her backwards, hard. She didn't have time to react. She landed on her back, her head snapping violently against the steps, snapping her neck, the screams ending abruptly. She rolled down the steps, coming to stop at the very bottom of the staircase, with her body mangled and her arms and legs twisted at impossible angles. As I looked at her lying there, I was sad. Sad that her suffering was over so quick. I didn't want this night to end. I'd no idea that vengeance and murder could be so sweet or fulfilling. Before I left, I made sure no one else was in the house, such as a maid. I found no one, regrettably. I left Alaric Whitewood's house that night knowing I'd exacted the ultimate revenge on they who'd wronged me. I returned home just before dawn. I threw the razor into the sewers on the way. I built a fire and burnt all the clothes I was wearing that night. I would leave no evidence whatsoever of me being anywhere near the Whitewood home that night. Sitting at my desk in the library, I reflected on my recent accomplishments. The more I thought about it, the more joy I felt. My vengeance was completed, and I was ecstatic to say the least. Entranced, I found myself fixated on the book that had initiated this journey into becoming a murderer. At first, I was unsure about picking up the item due to my previous experience with it. But my curiosity took over, and I decided to give it another chance by taking a closer look. With great care, I lifted the book from the table. To my surprise, there was no pain or confusion this time around. Instead, I felt a sense of calm and vitality. Unlike before, the book's cover did not engulf me, but a feeling of unity, happiness and achievement gradually emerged. As I skimmed through the pages, I was reminded of several of the written passages. Eventually, I came to Mordecai Blackthorn's gruesome account. I wasn't repulsed by his actions. Instead, the story of his revenge made me happy. I could relate now to what he'd done. In some strange way, we were now brothers, connected by murder. I was going to close the book when I spotted a change in the pages. Terror washed over me as I saw that Blackthorn's story wasn't the last one in the book. There was another entry, so I began to read it. I instantly began to shake violently. This can't be. This new story is mine. It was the written account of every disgusting act that I'd committed in the Whitewood house. Every sick detail was written down. It was in my own handwriting and my signature was on the final page. My mind began to race and I felt as if my actions were no longer mine. I began to thrash about violently in my chair. Eventually falling to the ground, I began frothing at the mouth. I tried to scream, but my throat was so tight with fear I couldn't. The book tumbled from the desk, landing open and staring right at me. My heart raced as the pages turned, slowly working their way to the front. I was completely paralyzed, unable to move or avert my gaze. To my horror, the pages stopped at the section filled with cryptic symbols and a strange language. The lines started to blur and shift, and I found myself unable to look away. The lines on the page slowly began to take form, and the words came into focus in English. Despite my apprehension, I tried to read them, but I was afraid of what they might say. Unfortunately, my fears became a reality. As I read on, I felt as though I was losing my fragile grip on sanity. As the words became clearer, revenge has been exacted on them who deserved it most. Set out by the spirits in this book to whom you've played host. There are many that deserve this fate, as many are those who've died. When and where will vengeance strike next? The book will decide. It was clear now what had happened. I'd been, and still am, possessed by the book to kill those who it decided had committed wrongs. I was a mere tool to this horrible spirit. At that moment, I realized that I was never going to be released. I was doomed to obey the commands of whatever spirit this was and would be forced to do his killing. For an extended period, I lay on the library floor, pondering the impact this would have on my life. After hours of resisting this spirit, I realized my efforts were pointless. With soul, body, and mind, I gave in to the spirit. I knew what I had to do. The bell above the door rang annoyingly as I entered the old bookstore. I had no idea that this store existed, and found it by chance while exploring this bit of town. As an advanced collector of rare and valuable books, I was ecstatic to stumble on this hidden gem. As I started to look over the little inventory the shop had to offer, I was interrupted by a very old man, shaking, obviously nervous. "Welcome to my bookshop," the old man said. "I am the owner."